In one capital city of a kingdom called Gallia, a boy named Cleo studied diligently. He was the heir of one of the most famous Farsid families. The protagonist graduated from the best educational institution in the kingdom and was ready to become the new head of the family, but until today. Just then, a full man came up to Cleo and said to him with disdain, "From today, Cleo, the Farsid family disowns him." The boy looked questioningly at the man. "What?" The Farsid family is considered one of the most influential in the capital. Grabbing the protagonist by the scruff of the neck, the uniformed man told him that they didn't need someone who couldn't do anything, and he had always told him that. His face got as close to Cleo as possible, and he asked him that during his time at the academy, practical training, and who cares what, let him tell him one thing: had he ever ranked first? Cleo hesitated, and the man violently threw him to the floor. The hero thought it was exactly as his father had said. Cleo couldn't say that he lived under this family's rule of being the best. He had pointed out this point many times since he was born. Whether it was magic or swordsmanship, it didn't matter what. He had to be the best. No again. The man got frustrated and started throwing things. Cleo has second place, and he dares to call himself the heir of the family? Let him know his place. Tears welled up in Cleo's eyes. He always wanted to take first place, but it never worked out. No matter what he takes on, it's always second place, which means he's a useless loser to the family. The full-figured man sat down at the table and told Cleo that in that case, the Farsid family would disown him. But since he is not a spewer, he will give him money for small expenses. Tomorrow, Cleo must leave the capital. The hero clenched his fists and, standing on all fours, stared at the floor, then said that he understood everything. At that moment, he lost his belonging to the Farsid family. The next day, the boy stood at the exit of the castle. The butler that stood in front of him asked him to take care of himself and handed him a small bag. The bag contained a day's supply of food, some money, and ordinary clothes, which he realized soon enough. The family crest of the house Furshade, which until now supported the hero and everything disappeared from everywhere without a trace, and now he is Cleo, became the most ordinary guy. The hero was walking on the bridge on his way out of town, and thought about the fact that if he is told to leave town, he has no idea where to live outside of town. Does he really have to leave town just because House Furshade is gone? Why is he considering this option? Can't he just stay in the capital? Well, maybe it's for the best. After all, it meant that he could live wherever he wanted. Reaching the middle of the bridge, Cleo looked at the views of the city. Stepping a foot on the edge of the bridge, he jumped down. Cleo certainly wasn't an expert, but he knew where to use his skills learned at the academy. There was only one place that fit that description. Exactly the place where you choose your life yourself. Cleo abruptly opened the doors wide open and found himself in the Adventurers Guild, a place where one could step outside of normal life. He smiled and thought about the fact that he had never seen this place when he was an aristocrat and had to go to registration first. The protagonist was in a cave at the exit of the city. He was now on his own. In his hands, Cleo held a lantern that illuminated his path. According to the information from the guild, there are only weak monsters here. He wanted to fight the local monsters and test his strength. The girl handed Cleo his map. It's just a piece of paper, but it's what makes people adventurers. Now just need to take the task from the board, and one could also find a group of people for the assignment. But Cleo is determined. First, he needs to see what he can do on his own. Can he defeat a giant dragon by himself? How long could he last? Cleo wanted to find out. The dragon roared. Opening its maw, it spewed fire at Cleo. In an instant, everything was covered in fire. Seeing nothing, the dragon paused. After a while, Cleo appeared from the ashes of fire. In front of him was a defense spell that worked without problems and protected the hero. The dragon rushed upwards, and Cleo thought about the dragon's hard scales, which make up the dragon armor. Explosive magic will work here. With these thoughts, the guy reached out his hand and began to create magic in front of him. Cleo thought, what kind of damage will it do? His magic should break anything, so he shot it straight into the dragon's mouth. Cleo thought, now there should be an attack, but he didn't have any sword on him. Try attacking with magic. Cleo gathered his thoughts. In the Magic Academy, he always lost to his childhood friend, so he was number 2. But still, He mastered destruction magic and could use other high-level magic. Cleo created a powerful explosion. It was quiet after the blast. Cleo exhaled and thought about how he wasn't sure if he could do it without the enhancement wand, but it was enough to destroy the dragon. The power was enough to blow its head off. The dragon seemed to be made of tiny crystals. The guy filled his backpack with them as much as he could and thought that it should probably be enough to make some money. That was it for today. It was time to head back to the guild. In the dark side of the corner, a hooded man was looking at him from behind a rock. He looked at the protagonist in surprise and thought that he was good. Cleo was looking at the crystals. This piece of crystal is called a magic element. If he brought it to the guild, he would receive a reward in return. The guy thought, how much is a magic element extracted from a dragon worth? He had killed demons, 8 hydras, and now 1 dragon. The girl at the guild gave him a map. So that's how much this magic element is worth. And he only received a dozen gold coins from his father. The reward is on the card. You can draw from it and deposit it with the magic circle. There's also a name and amount listed here. Cleo thought it would make his life a lot easier now. His stomach rumbled. The guy thought about eating, even though he didn't want to go anywhere. 2 cute girls in maid outfits and mugs of beer hovered over the customers and handed them their order. Cleo was uncomfortable here, since he's underage and doesn't drink alcohol, but a bar is a place to exchange information. The hero smiled and asked for 5 gold coins worth of food. After he got the card, everyone seemed to go crazy and asked him to wait for a while. The people in the bar turned around to look at him. What's the matter? Did he do something wrong? Suddenly, a silhouette appeared in front of him. A hooded guy greeted him and asked if the seat next to him was taken. Would he mind if he sat down? Taking off his hood, the young man introduced himself. His name was Kin Dinro, and asked what the hero's name was. The hero answered him that his name was Cleo, and the last name was not that important. A girl came up to them and brought them a drink.
Keen and Cleo continued their conversation.
So that's how it is. So he is from a poor family. Keen took the glass, and in honor of the acquaintance, they clinked the glass and mug with each other. Keen asked Cleo, so he is a lone adventurer. Cleo said he'd only become an adventurer today. Kin extended his hand to him. Then there's a short conversation here. Would he like to join him? It's good that they are in the same royal capital. Any group is short-handed. Cleo was so happy that he shook Kin's hand. Calling him brother, he told him that he was afraid of being alone too. They were interrupted by a girl in a maid's uniform and apologized for keeping them waiting. They brought their dishes, all for 5 gold pieces. Who could eat that much? All the tables were bursting with food, so they ended up eating all together in the tavern. 2 heroes were walking through a dark cave. A quest to kill such a strong monster. Would it be all right? Kin smiled at him. Let Cleo not worry. He's not some ordinary mage out there. If he was born in another family, he would have become a royal mage. Cleo smiled, and remembering the royal family, he thought, how is Liliana doing? Kin asked Cleo what class he was. Cleo looked at him questioningly. Suddenly, a demon king appeared in front of them. It was a demon-shaped monster, the head of the demon tribe. His ability was magic light bullets, or a shot an order of magnitude more powerful. Cleo jumped out at him, and Kin smiled and told him to be careful, because if the demon noticed him, he would kill him with his first attack. Cleo shouted to him that he understood. Kin also asked, he's a mage, isn't he? Why is he carrying a sword then? Cleo looked confusedly at the belt where his sword was hanging. He replied that it was for the mage's swordsmanship. Kin smiled and said that in that case he expected a lot from him. Cleo thought sadly that he would not be able to live up to his expectations as he was only second in sword fighting. Kin looked from behind the rocks and said that he found it. Cleo jumped out in front of the demon and said he would be the bait. Kin agreed and said he would soon cast a powerful spell. Cleo taunted the demon, jumping at high speed to confuse him, and shouted to Kin to start. Kin shouted a spell. He called out an ancient flame that would consume everyone. The demon was becoming more and more enraged. More and more clusters of magic were swooping around, and the demon tried to consume them. Kin shouted out, summoning an ancient flame. Let it burn. A huge, powerful fire flame appeared. At the place where the demon stood, A huge black bottomless pit was formed. Kin asked Cleo how he felt about his great magic. Cleo was delighted and told him that it was not for nothing that he called himself a royal magician. Keen grinned. Cleo said that he would never reach such heights. Seeing his powerful magic, he involuntarily thought of her. In the haze of the mist, two eyes suddenly appeared as if looking at them. Kin uttered in horror, "Why is something like this happening here? This kind of thing simply couldn't be happening." The situation was developing in the worst possible way. Kin said that from now on, Cleo must follow his instructions, and now the quest was over. A wild shaking started, both of them tensed up. What was that? Before them appeared a huge, scary creature that resembled a skeleton. Larre, the king of skeletons. Kin said that the skeleton king is immune to magic, completely immune. And he can avoid physical attack by moving through the air. And that giant bow, they can't even get close to him. Keen told Cleo that they should run, but he didn't even move. Keen asked him what he was up to. Cleo told him that they couldn't escape. They were already surrounded by more skeletons. Cleo asked him not to move, or at least use protective magic against being hit by arrows. Kin looked at Cleo worriedly and asked him, what about himself? He's fine. Cleo turned to him and replied that he was still the best swordsman in the world, well, the second strongest. After Aruna, a bunch of arrows flew at them from all directions. Cleo drew his sword from its sheath. In one fell swoop, he reflected all the arrows that flew at them. Kin saw it opened his mouth in surprise. With a swing of his sword, Cleo cut off a limb of one of the skeletons. It wasn't a question of whether he could do it, he just had to do it. Cleo struck straight at the skull of the enemy. Behind him were 3 more skeletons. He was only thinking that he didn't know if he could win with his level of swordsmanship. After all, he was only second. But if he didn't fight, his comrade would die. Keen looked at his comrade with delight as Cleo landed blows one after another. Kin's eyes shone, and he pronounced that Cleo's strength, it was unbelievable. He bragged about being a great magician, but compared to this guy, he as an adventurer was just nothing, even if his magic skills were superior. While he was thinking of his own, Cleo shouted out that this was the last strike. With a stroke, he cut the monster's skeleton in half. Kin covered his face with his hands from the terrible wind and dust that rose from the terrible battle. Kin thought that Cleo was someone else. Cleo turned to his comrade and asked if he was wounded. Rin looked at Cleo in surprise and thought that for saving his life, he thanked him and swore allegiance to him. At the same time, in the Farside family, the man that threw Cleo out screamed that he was only following the Duke's decree. Kneeling before the girl, he said that he, Dan Farside, never did anything wrong, and she knows it. A girl named Liliana cried out for him to shut up, calling him a fool. How dare he deny Cleo? Liliana was a princess of the kingdom of Gallia. She was out of her mind with anger, and pointing her finger at the chubby man, said that he must immediately find out where Cleo went, and if Dane couldn't, the Duke's family would destroy him. It was nighttime in the courtyard. Liliana tiredly threw herself on the bed and thought, well, why does no one really understand him? The others refused to acknowledge Cleo. Liliana sighed and thought she would wait a little longer. Going to the window, the girl looked sternly at the reflection in the window and said, don't let him say that he forgot. She will make him keep the promise he made that day to Cleo. Kin greeted Cleo by wishing him a good morning. He apologized for keeping Cleo waiting and asked what assignment he would be taking today. Leo sighed and told him that he was pleased that Rin was grateful for the rescue, but had he changed his attitude towards him? Rin asked him, what was he talking about? A few days after the battle with Larise, from that moment on, Rin's behavior changed drastically. When Cleo woke up after the battle, he greeted him politely right at his bedside. Keen told him that the elves take an oath to those who have done them a great favor and will serve him until he repays the debt, because the oaths they make are etched in their souls. Cleo looked at this and thought about how badly this could end. He sighed and said that he would probably get used to it someday. Approaching the main guild stand, Cleo saw some commotion. A girl soldier loudly slapped her hand on the table and said that she was looking for a guy named Cleo. She had heard rumors that he was the best swordsman in the guild, and she wanted to challenge him to a duel. Cleo called out to her from behind. The girl called him boy and asked him what he wanted. Cleo asked confused, Where did she hear that he was the best swordsman in the guild? The girl introduced herself. Her name was Ridden. She aspires to be the best swordsman in the world. Cleo introduced himself by another name and said his name was Dan. Kin introduced himself by his name and smiled. The girl wondered about Dan's name. Had she heard of such a thing? While she stood in thought, Cleo took Keen by the scruff of the neck and headed up the stairs, apologizing. Cleo told her he still had urgent business to attend to. The girl thought for a moment and then pointed at the elf. Here he was telling her, so it was all the elf's fault. Cleo took Keen by the clothes with a nervous, strained smile. The elf smirked. The girl smiled, remembering that she hadn't introduced herself yet. Walking down the path, Cleo turned to Keen. He's certainly better at swordsmanship than the average swordsman, but he wouldn't want to stand out too much. And Cleo is definitely not the best swordsman in the world. Keen apologized with his head lowered. The protagonist looked at him nervously and said that next time he should choose his words properly. He wouldn't want to have to deal with Keen's problems later. He's not even the best swordsman in town. In fact, the Order of Knights in the capital city has Aruna, aka the Rock. He is the strongest swordsman in the world. Shortly after graduating from the academy, Aruna was appointed as the deputy leader of the order. His sword technique was called an innate talent. During his time at the academy, he had defeated Cleo many times. He was always in second place, and that feeling of defeat could not be compared to anything. Kane apologized to Cleo. Just then, the same girl named Irio appeared behind them out of nowhere. She asked if Dan had finished his business, addressing Cleo. The guys stood there confused and shocked at her sudden appearance. She explained that they had a quest in this forest and she just wanted to stretch before meeting Cleo. Cleo thought about how shitty everything was right now, because if she went with them, Kin might blab. Irio turned to Cleo, but already calling him by his real name, with permission to ask him something. Cleo turned and without thinking asked, "What was it?" Irio smiled and said that she had finally found him. Irio seemed to come to life. She greeted him again and asked if he would be willing to duel with her. Cleo thought about the fact that he was in trouble, but still agreed. Kin kept apologizing to Cleo. Cleo calmly cleaned his blade, said there was nothing to be done, and asked the elf if he had heard of the Ridden family. Kin looked at the boy questioningly and said that he had heard of such a family for the first time. Cleo calmly answered him that it was because that family no longer existed. No wonder why Kin doesn't know about it. With those words, he slid the blade back into its scabbard. Kin was surprised to hear that the family no longer existed. It happened a few years ago. The Ridden family was a small family of knights. But at some point, they had a conflict with another family. One of the most powerful families, the Clefus family. The conflict was resolved by a duel, and whoever was speaking for the Ridden family. Kin interrupted him and asked if Cleo was talking about Irio. Cleo buttoned his robe and said that it seemed they were both candidates for the next head of the family. It was definitely their birth name. Ridden family lost a duel and then was defeated. That's probably why she wants to become the best swordsman in the world. Pulling on his glove, Cleo smiled and said that they would end this sad journey with Irio. Kin, walking down the stairs behind him, asked why Cleo cared so much. Cleo replied that he was already somewhat familiar with it. The duel would take place in the center of the guild. People asked each other who will fight. The first one wants to become the best swordsman in the world, and the second one is a newbie that defeated the dragon and Larry. People got excited. Finally, there's a chance to check those rumors about the newcomer. Who will they bet on? Someone from the crowd answered that he wouldn't bet on anyone because he hadn't seen their strength and he didn't want to risk it. Irio thanked Cleo for coming and not running away. Cleo bowed to her in return. Irio noticed that by his demeanor he was a nobleman. Cleo smiled and said it was his secret, but if she won, she would find out. Irio smiled and replied to him that he seemed to have a reason for hiding it. The girl judge shouted to them that they can use anything except magic. There are no other restrictions. After the signal, they could begin. They started. The signal sounded and both of them simultaneously pointed their weapons at each other. Irio furiously swung at Cleo with a punch, but he stopped her sword with his small blade. Cleo thought that she had a beautiful and fast technique, and also a strong will. Pressing down on her sword, they jumped away from each other. Then both of them threw themselves into the attack. Once again, their blades collided with each other, and the girl smiled and told him that he was quite calm. Cleo smirked and said that he was actually already desperate. Cleo thought that it felt like they were talking to her through their swords. He was sure she felt the same way, that there was no way they could overcome that wall, his unique sword technique. Irio thought about the fact that he and Cleo were just two warriors facing each other, but she thought about the fact that she even felt sympathy for him. Keen heard talk in the crowd about "isn't this kid good?" The two of them. And that the duel between the newcomers is on a level, and no one even knows who will win. Cleo smiled and said that she has a smooth and beautiful technique and a strong will. Irio thanked her, saying that no one had praised her in a long time. Cleo told her that her technique was too spectacular, to which the girl asked him to show her how to do it. Sharp and quick punches sprinkled in, which they bounced off each other. She did not relent. Spectacle for fencing technique has always been an optional element, but by no means mandatory, so this is its weak point. This style is beautiful and highly deadly. All you have to do is knock Irio out of rhythm. Cleo was spinning these thoughts in her head while throwing punches at Irio. Having knocked her out of rhythm, he seized the moment and struck her. Groaning in pain, Irio thought about the fact that she had let him distract her with his overhead kick, and he hit her in the open abdomen. The girl fell right to the front seats and knocked over the gawkers that were watching the fight. Cleo thought about her trying to shorten the distance after that, but it was too predictable. Irio did lash out at him at speed, yelling that it wasn't over yet. If we talk only about fencing, they were equal. But in a battle, it's not only sword skills that decides. The man Cleo couldn't defeat showed him how to be a winner. Martial arts is also a type of battle. After Irio faced Cleo with his swords, he quickly ducked down and gave her a lobbing kick to her ribs, knocking her out of her stable state. It seemed like her body had already started to shake. Cleo braced himself for the blow. An instant later, he whistled and knocked the sword out of the girl's hands. Cleo thought about how he was always second best, but Aruna made him stronger. Cleo smiled and asked her about if they were done. Irio was kneeling in front of him as her sword slid into the ground behind her. The girl judge shouted that Cleo had won. At the shouts of Cleo's victory, the people cheered. Everyone shouted his name. Irio clenched her teeth and fell to the floor, clenching her fists. She thought about losing again. Nothing had changed since then. A few years ago at the training ground of the Night Order, on that day, a duel for the fate of two families was about to begin. The first, a small aristocratic family of Ridden. The other, the aristocratic Clefa's family, a one-on-one battle between the next heads of household. That was the condition proposed by the Ridden family. The Ridden family believed that Irio, who was ranked first in fencing in the royal family of the academy, would win this duel. She exclaimed to her enemy Aruna Clefas that today would decide everything. But the latter only told her to keep quiet, calling her nervous. Opposing her was Aruna, the talented eldest son of the Clefas family. His whole demeanor showed how he didn't care about fencing. She hated him for that. That's why when the duel started, she was glad that she could finally beat the crap out of him. Maybe because of personal feelings, she lost. With that defeat, the Ridden family ceased to exist. The power, the noble title, the residence, it was all lost. They had to move to a city far away from the royal capital. Irio was beaten, screaming that because of her defeat, the family had lost honor, dignity, position, everything. Does she realize what she's done? Does she realize she's ended thousands of years of family history? The man who beat her said it was all her fault. After all, she had suffered such a devastating defeat. When she almost lost the will to live, she met her. It was a maid who said hello to her and told her that from today she would be working for them. Her name was Senna. She was wearing an apron with sleeves. She was cute. Her cat ears gave away that she was a beastman. Brown hair and azure eyes. I think her race is called Werned. She leaned over Irio and said it was nice to meet her. Irio didn't care why she was assigned as a maid, but Senna's smile made her feel good. Perhaps it had to do with the fact that she hadn't heard from anyone but her father in almost a year. Senna brushed her hair and told her that she was sorry that a beauty like Irio didn't look after herself. Irio answered her that it was okay. She wasn't good at dressing up anyway. For as long as she could remember, she was always with a sword in her hands. Senna pouted and said she was wrong. Irio is a girl herself, and she should at least take care of herself a little. In a matter of days, Senna found her way into Irio's heart. Senna gave Irio a mirror. Looking into it, she saw a well-groomed, beautiful girl with a ponytail. Senna smiled and hugged her from behind and said she was a real beauty. Irio blushed and wanted to say something, as Senna told her that a simple thank you would be enough. Senna turned away from Irio and the latter asked her if everything was okay. Senna apologized and said that she just remembered her little sister that she left behind in this village. Irio noticed that it was unusual for her to say something personal. Irio asked what was her name. She would like to know if she didn't mind. Senna smiled and replied that her name was Lena. Irio smiled and said that meant that Lena was a sister to her too. Senna asked her what she meant by that. Irio blushed and embarrassedly said that Senna is like a sister to her. The maid was so happy about this news and exclaimed that she was like a sister to her because she did her hair. Irio was embarrassed and said it was hard for her to answer. She hadn't been outside in a long time. After she felt better, she begged her father and still got permission to go out. Senna led Irio by the hand and told her that she wouldn't get better from sitting in the barn all the time. She needed to spend more time outside. The town they were in was called Arka. It was far to the east of the royal capital and had a very special culture and customs. People here wore kimonos instead of their normal clothes, and many buildings were made of wood. Senna asked Irio if she wanted to try on a kimono. Irio was embarrassed. Standing in a store with various displays, Irio was embarrassed and said that she shouldn't, and that it wouldn't fit her. Senna exclaimed, "What is she saying?" But then Irio saw something in the window. Senna asked her what's wrong. Irio took the piece of jewelry in her hand and said it was nothing, just a pretty thing. Senna looked at it and said that if so, let Irio take it, and she will take one for company. Senna smilingly grabbed Irio's hand and asked her to share it with her. After all, she had heard her master scolding her very badly, and she was sure it wasn't Irio's fault herself. If she is suffering a lot, wouldn't she share it with Senna? How Irio wished the days with Senna would last forever. She was so sorry that she didn't have time to tell her how she felt. Sitting in the barn, Irio thought about Senna being late and decided to look outside. She saw a crowd of people wearing masks and identical costumes. They grabbed Irio and tied her hands. Throwing her to the rest of the captives, Irio saw that all the relatives, vassals, and servants were here. Senna was also here. However, what were they to do now? The rest of the captives pounced on her and began to ask what to do. After all, it was her fault everything was happening now. She had to take full responsibility now. When the people who captured them came again, Irio yelled at them, asking who they were. They didn't look like bandits since they were heavily armed. Irio cursed, thinking that she had too little training lately. It's impossible to defeat so many people under these conditions, but she has no other choice. Abruptly, the door swung open again, and they were shouted for all the captives to shut up. Irio was kneeling in front of the rest of the captives, and the man with the sword asked what they were whispering about. The hooded man with the sword said that they had asked for it, and he would kill one of them as an example. Judging by his build and manner of speech, he was probably the ringleader. He looked at Irio. All the captives started shouting at him to take Irio away, calling her trash. After all, it was all because of her. If she hadn't lost then, things would have been different. Let her know her place. Irio was crying and thinking that it was all her fault. It was all her fault. She shouldn't have lost the duel. It was the first time she felt such hatred, as if she was an outcast who wasn't even supported by her own family. Then a voice arose and said she would go with him. Senna screamed at the top of her voice, telling everyone that they were crazy and that this was wrong. She would be their hostage. Everyone fell silent. Senna firmly stated that she was the only one they could use, so let them take her. The soldier pointed his finger at her and said they were taking her away. The soldier roughly took her by the hair and dragged her behind him. Irio looked at her in shock. But Senna told her that if it was for her, then it was okay. Irio blamed herself. She told herself it was her fault. But now they had a chance to escape. Because of the words of those people, something broke in her then. These people still think she's a thing. Senna sacrificed her life for them. She's had enough. She's not going to sacrifice herself for them anymore. A soldier came running in and opened the door. shouting at them to shut up. He was surprised to see Irio standing in front of him. She turned to the crowd and threw her blade right between the legs of the man, who barely dodged it. The girl coldly told them if they wanted to escape, let them do it themselves, and immediately rushed towards the exit. She couldn't let the only person important to her die. Senna, Irio kicked one soldier on the way and knocked him down. After withdrawing her sword in front of the crowd of people, those nervously demanded to finally release them, but she only clenched her sword tighter. While Senna was walking in the rain with the people, she heard sounds of fighting behind her. Turning around, she saw Irio that was covered in blood. She was getting rid of everyone in her path. Thinking that she had found them, Irio aimed at the most important one, thinking that she would kill him with one blow. This became the decisive event. But the man grinned in a grin and aimed at Senna, sticking his sword into her. Senna smiled, her mouth bleeding, but she told Irio she was glad. She believed she was coming to save her, tears welling up in her eyes. People began to scatter around as Irio held Senna in her arms. Senna responded warmly to her. Whatever she blamed herself or cried, she was happy to meet Irio herself. Irio let out a piercing scream, and what came after, she no longer remembered. Senna smiled widely and leaned her palm against Irio's face, and asked her to keep the memory of her in her heart. She would always be a slug to her. Irio, through her tears, asked not to leave her alone. But it was too late. Turning toward the crowd of dead warriors, Irio froze with sword in hand. Senna lay behind her. But returning to her, Irio dropped the sword and knelt before her. This all started from the moment she lost the duel. Her father came up behind her with an umbrella, telling Irio that this would not have happened if she had won the duel. What would she say? The only way to get rid of the stigma of being an outcast was to get revenge. Irio wondered, revenge? Revenge won't help her get Senna back. On the contrary, revenge is a way to vent her anger. However, after seeing that girl's death, she wished she could run away and forget about it. Her father told her to take revenge on Aruna. To achieve that, Irio must improve herself. Irio's cold gaze looked somewhere in the void, and she answered her father in agreement. She kneeled before him and said that she would become the best swordsman in the world and defeat him. Her father said he believed in her. She devoted herself to fencing, not for revenge. Maybe in the beginning that was the reason, but afterwards she no longer wanted to see her weakness. A few years later, she met a boy named Cleo and was defeated again. After so many years of hard work and training, she once again failed to win. Because she underestimated him, this boy was able to easily defeat her. Irio looked at the floor. She said that it wasn't over. She could still do it. But then Irio said that she lost. What does Cleo want? What's he gonna say? Will she have to give up something? Or will he want to use her? Will it be hell again like those days? Or would she lose someone again? Cleo bowed to her. He smiled at Irio and invited her to forget about her revenge and join his squad. Irio looked at him. She was shocked. What? Why revenge? Cleo replied that he had heard that she had lost many things that were important to her. But he told her that he didn't think it was her fault. And why shouldn't she share her suffering with others? Irio remembered Senna's words. They were exactly the same. Tears came to the girl's eyes and she cried. She replied that she agreed to join his group. Irio thought about what a kind person Cleo is. He treats her like a human being, just like that girl. The man holding the mug asked how Cleo's father was now. The girl standing at the window answered him that he was filing daily searches in every city around the world. The man noticed that the girl seemed to like the look of the one who kicked Cleo out, getting more and more horrible. The girl asked the man if he was already used to the order of knighthood. The girl called the man by name. It was Aruna. Aruna replied that of course he was already used to it. However, there are some very interesting personalities both in and outside the order. The world is so big. Aruna waved his hand and said that he had heard that there was a man with incredible power in the guild and he would like to meet him. He had also heard about a newcomer who was able to defeat a dragon, and that Aruna hadn't seen one at the academy. He approached the girl at the window and asked her to listen. Aruna told her that he wanted to change the knightly order more than the head of the order, more than anyone else. That was exactly the kind of man he wanted to be. The girl calmly sipped from the cup and told him that he seemed to be capable of many things. Aruna put his hands on the girl's shoulders and told her, Could she not answer him differently? The girl looked at the guy and asked, "So is this a marriage proposal?" Aruna assiduously shook his head in agreement. The girl said that in that case, he should promise that he would defeat Cleo. In the official battle, he had already won. The girl smiled and said, "What about a duel without rules?" Aruna and the girl sat opposite each other on the couch, and the girl continued to talk about how Cleo's father had not seen his real strength yet. In the Royal Academy, their generation was considered the most talented of all other generations. No one can compare to them, but the Duke decided to get rid of such a talented young man, just because he was ranked second. They shouldn't sit idly by. So the girl asked Aruna if he would take part in the search for Cleo. Aruna leaned over and asked her, was that all she had called him for? The girl smirked and told him that he agreed because he wants to marry her. It's been a week since Irio joined Cleo's team. Her fencing technique is still amazing. It's not a standard style like Aruna's, but very true to the basics, so whenever she struck, she didn't hesitate for a second. If their duel was purely a fencing match, Cleo doesn't even know who would have won. Now that he had even more friends, he thought about the fact that he was finally beginning his full-fledged adventurer career. Ario approached him asking if he was listening to her. Aruna smiled wickedly and replied to the girl that practicing swordsmanship, only Cleo could make him be serious. Kin turned to Cleo and said that they needed one more person in the pack, and that it would be better to look for someone with a support skill. Irio was supportive and said that would be great. Cleo said with a full mouth that they were right. But would anyone want to join such a little-known group? His friends looked at him like he was talking nonsense, and the people around him seemed to turn to him in bewilderment. Irio jabbed her finger at him and asked him what he was saying. And doesn't he know that they, or rather he himself, is very famous? Didn't he hear everyone talking about how he registered in the guild and defeated a dragon on the same day? They get invites to a lot of good guilds. Cleo said he was given that assignment when they found out what academy he was from, and was told he was from the awesome generation. Ario answered him that on top of that, he always comes back from the assignment with a whole mountain of magic crystals. Cleo exhaled and replied to Irio that if she collected them from every monster on the way back, she would gain the same amount. Kin only replied that it was just as he expected from their master Cleo. And after the fight with Irio, he fights others all the time, doesn't he? She didn't know what to say anymore. Irio said that Cleo is also constantly treating everyone in the bar, making unnecessary fuss. He certainly doesn't cause any problems for the guild, but the noise he makes in the bar can disturb the nearby stores. Irio also noted irritably that if there was a weakness in Cleo, it was his lack of awareness. Cleo thought for a moment and said that in that case they would talk to the guild tomorrow about recruiting. Then a shout was heard that told someone to shut up. At that moment, a short girl stood behind her and a certain huge man loomed over her, who irritably asked if she was listening to him at all. Irio looked up asking what all the noise was about. Keen looked at the big man. Cleo watched just as silently from the sidelines. He thought about the fact that it seems like there's going to be trouble. The huge man shouted at her that Gongsun wouldn't dare to contradict him and knocked over the table between them. A small drunken man came up from behind the crowd and asked him to calm down and have a drink with everyone, because today Cleo was treating everyone. The man turned to him in silence. With a furious and mad look, he ordered him to shut up. After hitting the little man, he flew some distance away from them. Cleo and Kin tensed up. The huge man turned to Mackey again and asked her if she had anything else to say. If she had nothing else to say, she better get ready. With a shout, he aimed his fist at the girl. Cleo, gritting her teeth, realized that things were bad and tried to run to the target in time. Thinking that the man wasn't thinking straight, Cleo pushed the girl away at the moment of impact. He had time to conjure defense magic at full power, but noticed the rebel's fist punching him. The guy was shocked and thought to himself that this can't be happening. Developing a defense spell, the man hit Cleo with such force that he flew off a considerable distance. The girl ran up to Cleo with horror, asking if he was all right. The huge man turned to her, saying that since she was silent, someone had decided to intercede for her. He looked at the people behind him with hatred, and said that it seemed that there were no more such brave men. But then he suddenly felt a blow. It was Irio, who tried to wound him with a sword. But the man dodged and asked her what she didn't hit and grabbed her arm. Ario looked at him and thought, who is he? Standing up, Cleo saw that his entire left arm was immobilized and bloody. He thought about the man's incredible strength. Not even a dragon could do that much damage to his shield. The giant seemed to be insulted and yelled about whether Irio knew who he was, aggressively grabbing her hair. He threw her with all his might against the table, which shattered beneath her. After she fell, he told her to stay out of his way. Cleo yelled at him not to dare raise his hand on a little girl. Keen approached Irio, looked at the man warily, and told her that he knew who he was. The giant yelled that he shouldn't stick his nose in other people's business if he didn't know what was going on, calling the girl a bitch. He said she ignored his orders, even though he was the leader. The girl exclaimed that they should have retreated and healed everyone in that situation. Or she could have gone to the front lines to heal them. So why did he make them all attack? The giant roared in rage that he was the leader, which meant everyone was nothing more than his pawns. It doesn't matter how many people die. They are easily replaceable. The people around them were silent, staring at the floor. Cleo squeezed his bloody hand and said, "Isn't he serious?" The giant put a huge hand on the girl's head and rudely told her that she was the only one complaining. The protagonist caught the giant's hand and told him that he had lost his mind, and that's all his friends meant to him. The man only snapped back and said that Cleo shouldn't stick his nose in other people's business. Cleo told him that if that's the case, then why don't they fight? The boy asked the giant that he himself would take care of the girl. Maybe it was not his business at all, but he could not see how such a girl was in danger. The giant laughed out loud and raised his head and said that Cleo could not do such a thing. The giant smiled and looked at Mackey and asked what she was going to do. The man made a creepy face and not willingly agreed with Cleo and shouted to him that he could take her away, scheduling a meeting for the next day early in the morning. They agreed to meet in the town square on the outskirts of town, and the giant threatened Cleo by poking him in the chest with his finger so that he would not even think of running away like a mutt. Irio, Kin, and Cleo were alone in the room. Kin told them that that giant was known throughout the capital. His name was G Orzol, and he was an adventurer of C rank. Cleo calmly answered them that he knew he was a bit hasty, but there was nothing more he could do. What mattered now was his wounded arm. His friends asked him how she was. Cleo answered them that it was healing, though his own treatment could hardly be called first aid. Cleo smiled and apologized to his friends, saying that he had been wrong to bring them into this. It had all happened by accident. He asked Irio how her wound was. Irio only told him that she was fine, and that she was just a scratch, not much damage. Keen, arriving in some shock, replied to Cleo that in any case he had messed with a very dangerous guy. His name used to be Gaun Sindelius. He was a member of the noble house of Sindelius. However, because of his cruel, arrogant character, not only his vassals but also his own father turned away from him. After being kicked out and disinherited, he quickly rose up the ranks of the guild by applying his skills. Though he became famous, his madness never subsided, and he took full advantage of his violent tendencies. He looks down on his comrades and rules his group through fear, but the guild, which promotes the ideals of meritocracy, has tolerated his behavior thus far. Cleo replied to Keen that he himself could understand that he had had a painful experience, but why would he do that to his comrades? Keen replied that he was just an angry tyrant. His family had disinherited him. The Sindeliuses were famous for creating wish-fulfilling jewels. Cleo thought to himself that nevertheless, he couldn't deny the fact that he felt bad. He was confused that he had allowed himself to take custody of Mackey before the duel. There are many things that bothered him about Gon. Someone knocked on the door, and Cleo allowed entry. A girl came in and apologized for the disturbance. It was Mackey. She wanted to thank them for their help. Cleo apologized for interfering in their business, but the girl said they were unbelievable. It was all Gohan's fault. The girl said she wanted to help them, not just thank them for their help, since she was a healer, and asked them to heal their wounds. Irio smiled and said that her wounds were nothing, and it would be better to help Cleo. Cleo replied that the girl did not need to push herself, but she gathered her courage and began to treat his arm. Kin and Irio were shocked at the amount of mana the girl had. That's why Gaun was so obsessed with her. Cleo also thought about the fact that her mana was so large that she didn't have much control over it. She is like an unpolished gemstone. The nature of her mana is characteristic of both regenerative magic and innate magic. Perhaps she has not yet recognized this trait herself. A moment and the arm was completely healed. Kin and Irio stood in shock. The girl, on the other hand, smiled and said that the arm was now fine. Kin replied that he was now convinced that Gown didn't want to lose Mackey as a pawn, which is why he didn't hesitate to agree to the duel. Cleo thought to himself that maybe something was wrong. Besides, Mackey has nothing to apologize to him for because that fist would never hit her. Irio flared up and asked Cleo what this was all about. He, on the other hand, stood up for her, determined to protect her. Cleo replied that he knew it himself, so he took the punch. Judging by the trajectory of that punch, he would have just missed Mackey. He was probably just trying to intimidate her. Cleo also thought about the fact that he was holding back. Needless to say, a blow that would have shattered his defense spell should have done a ton more damage to him. But halfway through that one weakened his power. Oh, and the strange thing was that the Irio was almost unharmed at all. Cleo felt that Gown was hiding something underneath that violent temperament. Cleo turned to Mackey, saying that she must have noticed Gown's uneasiness too. Mackey agreed with him. Irio replied that she didn't know what he meant at all. He had no intention of hurting Mackey from the beginning, considering that he had probably also abandoned his comrades to protect Mackey. Irio only asked why he was saying that he was overthinking him, and that Gown was just an egregious rascal. Then the girl yelled out of the blue that they shouldn't talk bad about Gown. Gon did everything he could to keep her alive, and only her. She had no family or anyone else, and he was the one who took her in. Cleo asked her if she could tell him how they met. Perhaps then he would be able to understand him better. Keen hesitantly said, to understand if he had a purpose other than winning? Cleo replied that he sensed that Gown was trying to gauge his strength, and it made him uncomfortable. Tomorrow might be his toughest battle of his life. But he hadn't been this excited since challenging one of the best. Gown was drinking heavily, and thinking that this newcomer Cleo seemed to be strong after all, and he had balls, since everyone was talking about him like that. And Mackey went along with him without any resistance, thinking that now he might be alone. Gown thought if it was like that too, it would be even easier, but thinking that it didn't matter, decided to just take her back. Gown looked at his pendant around his neck, and thought about how Cleo is the first guy who isn't afraid of him after that man. May he not let him down. As the group of friends walked through the forest, Kin assumed the battle would take place in the ruined village. Irio asked Cleo if they had a plan of action, since their opponent was a rank C adventurer. They can't fight him head-on because he has inhuman strength. Cleo thought she was right, and he had been thinking about a plan since last night. He told his friends that it would take 3 tasks to accomplish his plan. It's a bit of a reckless venture, but if they take the risk, they can pull it off. The boys approached the meeting place. Gown looked at Cleo and praised the one who didn't run away. Gown said that he didn't mean to be harsh, but they didn't come here to talk, did they? The giant asked Cleo if he was ready. They were awkwardly interrupted by the maid who was the judge and said they could start. Gown told Cleo that he would not lose to him. Cleo also answered him that those were his words. The giant asked him to start quickly in that case, and barked at them that they were clueless. The girl coughed softly and said she would witness this fight, and introduced herself as a waitress from that tavern. The tavern had been damaged in their dispute yesterday, and the owner had instructed her to demand compensation from the loser of this match, to pay for repairs to the building. And since this duel is from behind Mackey, she will be watching along with her. However, she is not a referee, so all rules are up to the participants themselves. People started to gather around. There were more and more people, and it seemed like there were even more people than yesterday. Gown smirked and told Cleo that there seemed to be a lot of guys wanting to beat him and get some glory. This is when their plan began to take effect. A smoke screen appeared. Gown looked around, thinking that they couldn't see anything either. From behind him, he heard a sound. Cleo and friends made the best use of Irio's speed and Kin's mana. The first problem lay in how to deal with the outnumbering. Their opponent was choosing their own place of origin, still able to block their escape routes. With that in mind, they had to make a move first. Cleo was behind Gon, who turned to him and said that some lousy spell wouldn't work on him. Someone in the crowd pointed a finger and shouted at Irio, "What is she doing?" As she ran, she crested the ground with her scabbard. Cleo's plan was to draw a circle that would encircle the four of them. The gawkers squealed when they recognized the circle and asked each other what they were up to. Kin used his mana to create a wall that blocked the enemy's path. Gown grinned and shouted that he expected nothing less from them. That way, the others wouldn't be able to interfere. Gown assumed that they were aiming for numerical superiority, but also assumed that Kin's magic would be enough for a few minutes. Gown answered them that it was a good idea to divide their group, but if Kin fell, it would be the end for them. The giant asked them if they thought they could protect Kin with just the two of them. Cleo thought in his mind, could they protect Kin from an axe-wielding adventurer with both strength and more experience and still win? The second task they had to do was to overcome Gon's axe, which he was already intending to strike with. He yelled at them to come to him, since they didn't have much time because of Kin's magic. First, they had to measure the time. Irio and Cleo took a swing at Gon, while he also swung his axe. At some point, this all alerted Cleo. Together with Irio, Cleo was fending off Kon's blows and analyzing his strikes. The swing radius of his axe was large, but it was slower than they expected. Irio smiled and said she could handle it herself. Cleo shouted at her to stop, but Gown managed to hit her with the axe handle. Irio was shocked. How did he do that? Gown smirked and told her to get up since it was just beginning. She was the only one who didn't take him seriously. But Irio got up and ran at him, assuring him that she was serious about him from now on. Gown was surprised and thought about her getting faster. Defending himself from her strike, he was also attacked from below by Cleo. With swings of his axe, he reflected their blows from above and below. Cleo and Irio landed on the ground at the same time. They were knocked out of their strength just as the huge axe was about to strike them. They were pushed back, but Kin was behind them. The two of them probably couldn't do well against Gong's axe. Earlier, Cleo told his comrades that swords are a bad match against the axe. And that's not even taking into account its immense power. There'll be enough of a distraction at most. Kin would have to wait for the moment and then stop his axe with magic. Cleo wished he had caught it in his protective wall of mana instead of pushing it away. A barrier that won't reflect him or be broken, it would have to be a flawless mana barrier. Kin hesitantly told Cleo that he probably won't make it, but Cleo said he believes in him and that he is capable of much. Cleo turned to Irio and told her that while Gown was in shock that Kin had grabbed his axe, she would immediately cut off his hand holding the axe. A crystal spell was triggered that was called a rejecting absolute. Cleo assumed that he would put his mana into the battle axe. Even if Irio failed to chop off his arm, he would still let his weapon out of his hands. Cleo applied a freeze. Gown stood in front of Cleo surprised and said that he couldn't believe that he could use a spell specifically designed to capture people or monsters. It's a lot more fun than he expected, but he used up all his mana thanks to it as well. Looking at Kin, he replied that his mana was almost running low too. Gown was surprised that Cleo had gotten him to use several spells like this. According to Gown, Cleo was using his comrades just like himself. Looking at Irio, he replied that she couldn't do shit either since her weapon was broken. Cleo smiled slightly and said that it didn't matter. After all, his friends helped him with the preparations from the beginning. It was a battle just between them. Irio thought about how Gong's strength was no joke. She really didn't know if Cleo could defeat him. But today, he wasn't the same as usual. Usually Cleo underestimated himself, or made it seem like others owed him a favor. At times she had encountered other strong people like him, but when they discussed their strategy, his eyes were different. Mackey, who was observing everything, told the girl waitress that she had seen Gon face many opponents, but she felt that Cleo seemed to be different in some way. Fury, resentment, fear. Opposing him. What those emotions carried allowed Gown to further vent his rage and strike back at them. But the third challenge was also whether Cleo could defeat Goon one-on-one. Mackey noticed that Cleo seemed to be genuinely enjoying this challenge. Perhaps Gown was also waiting for someone like him to appear. Cleo suddenly turned to Gown, assuring him that he was hiding something, some truth about Mackey. Apparently Cleo had begun to suspect something after learning of her circumstances. Gownad told him that Cleo couldn't find out anything from her, since she herself knows nothing. If he wants to know everything so badly, no matter what, there is only one way. Gaunod said he would tell Cleo if he defeated him. Gauno repeated, if he wants to know about Mackey so badly, let him attack him with all his might. Cleo thought of the words that Kin had told him, that if he used the ferocious power he used during their first encounter, he could defeat Guno. Kin had to maintain his magic until Cleo unleashed his full power. If he couldn't surpass it, he would lose. Gauno abruptly approached Cleo, causing him to be confused. With fear in his eyes, he saw him about to hit him, and almost dodged at the last moment. The impact shattered the ground beneath them. Kin and Irio thought in horror that he was the one who was still holding back in the tavern. The girl judge closed her eyes nervously and asked what was going on. Mackey answered her that it was most likely Gaun's real power. First form, expert skill, limit breaking, first form. Cleo took off his outer garment. Gaun shouted to Cleo to approach him. In a leap, Cleo drew his dagger, trying to wound his enemy, but the latter blocked his blow with his hand and pushed the guy aside. Cleo was confused and wondered if even his first form didn't help him. He swung his dagger at Gaun, but he easily knocked it out of the guy's hands. The blade flew high into the air, then Cleo decided to just be sure. But at that moment in front of him, he saw a huge fist, which with all his might flew at him. At this moment, the guy thought that it was worth holding back more. Expert skill, limit breakthrough, third form. He stopped the enemy's huge fist with his bare hand. Kin and Irio thought in shock. How could he stop such a powerful fist? Gaun replied with a laugh as Cleo continued to surprise him. He was amazed how such a brat could use expert skills. Cleo thought about the fact that everyone in his class could use those skills, so it wasn't surprising to him. Even though he had finally mastered the expert skill, but he still couldn't use it to its fullest extent. His expert skill is to enhance all of his abilities. Expert skills were secret techniques that represented the pinnacle of discipline. Only a few people possessed it. He had heard that there were even more skillful ones, but he hadn't even fully mastered an expert skill yet. Divine Generation. However, it's a two-way stick. The strain on his body is very great, but he wanted to surpass it. Gong shouted to him to try it. Swinging with all his might, he was about to hit Cleo, but he calmly dodged the blow with great speed without blinking an eye. He then did a roll right under Gohan and grabbed his dagger, giving him a slash on the arm. Gaun swung at him, but Cleo made a fulcrum right on Gohan's shoulders and kicked him right in the head. Irio noticed that they were now equal to each other and asked Keen to hold out a little longer. Gaun and Cleo struck back at each other, one piercing his enemy's arms with a dagger, the other stabbing him right in the chest. Gaun thought about how he couldn't stop laughing. It was as if his whole life before was just one big lie. He couldn't believe that he had finally met an incredible person, and turned to Cleo and thanked him for coming before him. Gaun always heard people saying to each other in fear not to come close to him, asking what was that look on his face. His appearance and behavior did not befit an aristocrat, and spoke of driving him away. Cleo punched Gaun right in the face while he remembered that a girl had told him he wasn't like that, and she knew it. He remembered meeting Mackey and telling her not to burden herself. He had no choice since he had escaped the aristocracy. Most importantly, when he looked at her, he couldn't help but laugh. Why did everything happen when he wasn't around? It was beyond cruel. He remembered asking himself where his daughter had been taken. Was this all the work of the aristocrats? All the people whispered that his entire village had been slaughtered, only his daughter had escaped, but where she was still unknown, and Gaun was no longer the enthusiastic guy he was once known for. Now he was insanely scary. One day Gaun brought the girl a necklace, and said he made it from the prey he caught. He had heard that it had a guardian deity inside it, and that it would now be an amulet for the two of them and their daughter. The girl looked at his bleeding and asked him to help. In the midst of the fight, Gaun bellowed that it was all his fault. He remembered how the girl thanked him for everything he did for them. Gaun walked up to the low man and shouted at him, "Is that girl here?" From what he heard, she fit the description. The door to the room opened and a little girl appeared in front of Gaun, carrying a crystal pendant on her chest. Gaun thought about finding her after a few years, but she shouldn't be with him. He was waiting for someone who wouldn't waver no matter what dangerous group he had to fight. Someone who would gather allies without distorting the truth. He was waiting for an exceptional person who would stand up to him the way Mackey did. Cleo thought about being able to maintain his skill for about 10 more seconds. He hadn't made a fully effective strike against Gaon yet, but the next attack would decide the outcome of the battle. Ario heard Kin behind her fall down. Worriedly, she asked him, "How is he?" The protective barrier disappeared. Cleo swiftly tore at Gaon with her blade, putting all her strength into the strike. Gaon thought about the fact that he was going to give him the last most powerful blow, saying that it was naive. But he assumed the wrong punch. The knife went into his stomach. The giant grabbed the guy's wrist, leaving the knife behind. Cleo shouted to him, asking what is he doing. Gaon grabbed the blade, pulled it out of himself, and yelled to the guys that it was settled. Gaon told Cleo that he wouldn't even lay a finger on him now. Blood was coming from his wound. The girl judge and Mackey looked at him with surprise. No one interfered in the fight. Kin and Irio watched. To everyone's surprise, Gaon shouted out that he had lost. Now he could give the answer to his question about Mackey, and it was very simple. Mackey is his daughter. Cleo struggled to get up and asked why he had gotten this far then. Gaon said she was the only ray of light in his life. But why did he put himself in harm's way? Gaon smiled and said that she should be with Cleo since he ruined her life. But since Cleo is just like her, he won't let anything happen to her. Gaon smilingly fell to the ground, telling Cleo one last time that he leaves everything to him. Let him take care of Mackey. Gaon only thought about the fact that he was not the right person for Mackey. The guys who were on the same team with Gaon were shocked by what they saw and asked each other what to do next. They were shocked that someone could defeat such a monster. Ario and Kin didn't understand what was going on, and suspected that Gaon had deliberately set himself up to be hit. Mackey clutched her hands to her chest and thought about what Gaon had said to Cleo. Cleo shouted at the top of his voice that they couldn't let him die. Cleo turned to Mackey and apologized, saying he didn't have time to help her deal with her feelings. He didn't know what she was feeling right now, but he really wanted to save Gaon. He couldn't let it end like this. Cleo turned to Mackey and said that the two of them would save her father. Mackey ran up to Cleo and her father. The hero told her that the wound was deep and a lot of blood had been lost. They needed to hurry. Mackey asked if there was anything she could do. Cleo told the girl that her healing magic is incredible, but doesn't think it's perfect right now. Mackey asked the guy, so there's no way she can save Gaon. Cleo smiled and told her not to worry. Together they can save him. Magic is a combination of understanding, constructing, and deploying. The more mana a person has, the more powerful spells they can summon. In Mackey's case, she is not strong at constructing, meaning only half of her mana can be used. Cleo said he would take care of mana management, so she would need to use her power as usual. The people around her started to say that no matter how good she was, she wouldn't be able to stop such bleeding. Not even a new age saint could do it. But Cleo thought otherwise. She's just as good as Marin. Mackey thought back to how Gaon yelled at her that he was fine. She could finally understand why he was so nice to her. Always when she wanted to help him, he kept telling her to stay behind him where the rest of the goons could protect her. He kept telling her that if he was near her, she would die. The girl sobbed and kept saying, so why can't she save him? Everything around them was enveloped by the light of healing. Kin and Irio, surprised, said that it was incredible, but still not enough. Mackey tried her best. Cleo, sitting behind her, said he would help her, and channeled his magic into her palm as well. Kin noticed that something was wrong. Irio also noticed that their wounds were beginning to heal. Kin's mana was replenished, and the fatigue was gone. People around them began to notice that some of their scars were disappearing. The magic had an incredible healing power. It was impossible to believe that everyone in the radius began to heal. Everyone began to go blind from the bright flash of light to the point where people closed their eyes. Keen grinned, saying that Cleo was incredible as always. Ario asked him to explain what he meant. Such powerful magic can be handled if you specialize in using and controlling it. It's a magic that requires a huge amount of training, but since Cleo controls Mackey's power, it allows her to display the maximum effectiveness of magic for a moment. This is only possible because of Mackey's vast reserves, and Cleo's ability to control her instantly. Cleo apologized to Mackey, and said that it was for all he was capable of, as he was always second best. They still haven't reached her full potential, but the mana is dissipating and Mackey is already at her limit. However, they were able to save her father. Tears welled up in Mackey's eyes. She thanked Cleo, and Cleo told her that now they would be able to talk about many things as father and daughter. Much has changed in the months since then. Cleo has developed friendships with the people around Gon. Cleo heard that he had tracked down his comrades who were rampaging through the city. Gon told them that he could show them how to make more money. Guild rewards are usually divided equally among the quest participants, but it seems Gon always tells his comrades that he will protect Mackey again next time, and never takes his share. The guys in the group asked him if he was sure that all that gold belonged to them, since they had done nothing. But Gon said they deserved it, because they had protected Mackey. Gon called out to Cleo and told him to be careful since he was hanging around with their guys. They didn't know how to hold back in case of anything. Mackey smilingly greeted Cleo. The girl wished good morning and apologized for their delay. Cleo replied that they had just finished eating and were heading to the guild. Gon asked Mackey if she had everything she needed. He wanted to make sure she had everything: healing potions, medicinal herbs, a map, a change of clothes in case she got wet. Mackey asked uncertainly, did he need that much stuff? And that he shouldn't worry so much. Waving and saying goodbye to her father, she followed Cleo. Calling him daddy, she said she was leaving. Gon, embarrassed, told her to be careful. It's just a mundane scene, but it's priceless to the two of them. Meanwhile, in the throne room of Gallia Castle, a fat man got down on his knee and apologized for Cleo still not being found, assuring that he was still looking for him. The girl yelled at him and said that of course he was looking for him, because he was his father. The man bowed to the king and asked him to take pity on him. King Alandolf looked at him thoughtfully. Divine Generation, there were quite a few students in the academy this year, including his daughter Liliana. All of them are good in their respective fields of endeavor and are responsible for the prosperity of the capital. Although Cleo was behind those who could use their divine skills, he was still second in all subjects. This was more than enough to be useful for the good of the kingdom. Also, the king had told Cleo's father that even though their generation was weaker, they were still the best in their rank, so should have been able to realize what their son was truly capable of. Most likely his father's actions were for some other reason, and what was it? The one replied that he couldn't give an answer to that question. The girl, cursing the man, asked him to tell her the reason, if there was one. The king assured Liliana that everything was all right, and if he was silent, then he had a reason for not talking about it. The king said that there have been many cases of families being ruined recently due to factional disputes and clashes between noble houses. From the banishment of the eldest son of House Sindelius to the ruin of the Riddens, which is still shrouded in mystery. At the same time, since the monsters' quieter actions outside their kingdom after defeating the Demon King, they had recently become active again. He predicted when the next uproar would occur using his expert skill, the premonition of unrest. Within a month, some kind of calamity would hit the capital. Liliana looked at her father and told him that this was the worst time for it, if only he could predict it early. The king replied to her that he couldn't control his expert skill. The Night Order and many famous adventurers were currently absent from the capital due to being on a mission to investigate monster activity. Most of the Divine Generation had left the capital, or could it be that Alna and the others were in danger? Either way, they wanted to find Cleo faster. Then a lush-breasted beauty came into the room and asked to leave the matter to her. The one called the Saint of the New Century, Marin Sindelius. Liliana immediately lashed out at her, saying it had nothing to do with her. Marin asked her what she was talking about, obviously someone who would be helping the Duke with the search when her fiancé went missing. Liliana shockedly asked about the fiancé. Marin jumped up and down happily, her balloons shaking up and down. She said that Liliana would hardly understand, for she meant herself and Cleo. Liliana snapped at her and told her that the royal family didn't approve of such things, so she should watch her mouth. She replied with a sneer that since when did she get to decide who gets engaged to whom? Calling her infantile for more than her looks. Cleo's father wanted to insert his 5 cents and scratching his head wanted to thank them for looking after his son. But the two girls angrily looked at him and said that they were only doing it for Cleo's sake. The king turned to Marin, saying that they would postpone the matter for now, and asked her if there were any leads. Marin replied that it was hard to see anything under their noses and that they could leave the rest to her. Liliana thought about Alna searching outside and Marin searching inside the kingdom. Soon they would be able to find Cleo, but she was worried about her father's premonition. She thought about how Alna and the others were doing now, the land of peace east of the royal capital. Someone shouted to the guy, calling him vice captain, to wake up. Barely awake, the guy asked if they had already arrived, to which he was told by a soldier that the situation required haste. As it turned out, their cart was surrounded by monsters. Somewhere in the middle of the rocks, a previously unknown young man was practicing his strength. He was counting aloud. When Gown approached him, he told him that he worked every day. The boy greeted Gown and told him that it had become just his daily routine. After gaining strength, the young boy threw a huge boulder into the distance with all his might and used an expert skill, breaking through the limit. Gown noticed that he was using a rock that was already much bigger than the one at the beginning. The guy took the huge stone once more, intending to lift it. After the boulder was lifted up, the young man cut it in half with his knife. Gong laughed and noticed that he hadn't completely cut it in half, noting that he still had a long way to go. The young man was sure that he would cut him in half today, remarking that Gown's training regimen was too rigid, especially when he wears the power-burning bracelet that Gown had given him. He thought that he never would have thought about how tiring it was to have his body and mana in a weakened state. Gown asked about whether the bracelet had been worn while he was sleeping. Nothing else could explain the rapid growth rate he showed in such a short time. It looked like the boy would soon catch up to Gown in strength as well. He only said he wasn't sure. He didn't think he could crack this stone without the bracelet, even using his expert skills. Gown asked why there was such a rush, noting that the stones in the dungeon were quite strong. Gown replied to Cleo that he shouldn't worry about it, since he had challenged a rank C adventurer as a novice. Cleo embarrassedly thanked him. Gown told him that he had heard about the best students in the academy, but the only difference between them and Cleo was that he had naivety, and asked if that was the case. Cleo thought to himself that Gown was right. The hero replied to Gown that because of their battle, he realized actually how weak he was. Gown told him that he didn't know shit about anything. It's just that Cleo isn't heartless. He had the opportunity to kill Gown in the fight when he threw the final blow. He's held back by his naivete, not his strength. As for the academy's top students, Alna barely stretched out and told his comrades that he had such a good dream. He couldn't believe that they had to stand in the middle of the path. People were urging him to act faster because there were monsters outside, and from the looks of it, they had them surrounded. Alna turned his head around and only advised everyone to keep their heads down. He thought of something that might work in this situation. The soldier shouted to everyone and asked them to lie down on the ground. Alna drew his sword and used an expert skill. The boundless sword strike blew away at once both the roof of the carriage and all the heads of the monsters surrounding them. People were saying in shock, how did he manage to defeat all those monsters with one blow? One of the soldiers looked at this and said that it was to be expected from the vice captain, who was praised as a prodigy. Alna thought about the fact that he had not seen such things before, but he was glad that they were able to conceal their presence and approach them, while noting that these rocks were too soft. Cleo thought about the students of the academy. If he had never seen them, he couldn't imagine what they were capable of. Gong replied that one look at them was enough to understand. Consequences or expert skills are annoying. Cleo looked at his hand and noticed that it was numb, though he could get used to it. Alna and the others were on a completely different level. Almai, standing on the wreckage of the monsters, thought only about whether he could use such a skill on someone even a few times. He asked the people below if they were okay, and they said they were fine, even though they thought they were dead. It would have been bad with that many if they hadn't gotten to them first. A girl from their team asked why such monsters were here where they shouldn't be. The mage with the book looked at the stones and said that it was hard to believe, but according to his data, the same stones are nearby in the dungeon from their kingdom. It's a phenomenon he's never seen before. They could pose an even greater threat if they approach the kingdom. Is the situation really that serious? The girl turned to Alnani, telling him that the kingdom was now defenseless as the entire Royal Knight Order was taking part in this emergency reconnaissance mission. She asked him if they should go back. Alna firmly answered her that they would not go back. He assured her that the castle was guarded by strong warriors, so everything would be fine. And if there was a threat they couldn't handle, their presence wouldn't change anything. They will fulfill the duty assigned to them by the king. So they must move on. Alma ordered the cart to be repaired. Meanwhile, Cleo thought about the fact that if he wanted to reach new heights, he needed to train even more. Gaon asked him about the urgent matters that had interrupted his training today. Because of their recent fight, Cleo was flooded with requests. But this time it was from the guild itself. Cleo replied that he can't do it alone, so he's going to meet with the others. Does this have something to do with the rumors that the monsters are multiplying? And that you can't find the source until you go down into the depths of the dungeon? He had been to the depths of the dungeon before, so he thought it would be fine. Gyeong smiled and said that he didn't expect anything less from him. The guy smiled and said that it was only because his comrades were so talented. On top of that, with Mackey on the team, his team has become expert with a great balance. Gaon also remarked that no other group could match them. Cleo said goodbye to Gaon, assuring him that he was probably right. As he opened the doors, Cleo heard the scolding of bullying. Pounding the table with all his fury, the man asked where and what country he was in. Said there were monsters around. Cleo wondered what was wrong with this guy. The man behind the counter asked them if they were okay and said they were in the kingdom of Gallia. But the man didn't seem to want to hear him, saying something about Japan. The people around them became animated, and Cleo thought about the man, not understanding what Japan he was talking about. Abruptly waving away, the man headed for the exit. Roughly pushing Cleo, he told the guy not to get in his way. As if crying, the man shouted that he couldn't believe it, and that this world simply couldn't exist. Cleo looked at the strange man in the wake, and could not explain the unsettling feeling he felt at that moment. The man ran down the trail along the forest, getting more and more mad and laughing. If possible, he wanted to find any clues, returning to the place where he woke up. Cussing to himself, he thought to himself, who was the woman who appeared to him in the dream? She asked the man if he was a biologist and said she was pleased to meet him. The ghost girl took his face and said it must be hard to live up to your values. After all, he possesses something incredible that no human could ever understand. She said that she would give him a special power and place that would belong only to him. The man thought about it, not understanding what she was talking about. He thought about the fact that whether it was in his world or this one, there was no place for him anywhere. While the man was pondering his thoughts, a huge golem appeared in front of him. It struck the ground with all its might. Barely dodging, the man thought to himself that his death had come for him. But then he noticed that the golem had just bowed a stone palm in front of him, urging him to climb it. He waited. The man hesitantly stepped onto its palm, fearing what the golem might do if he refused. The golem put the man on his shoulder and walked deeper into the caves while he wondered where they were going. Upon arriving at his destination, the man ranted about what this place was and why were there monsters here. On the ground in front of him was some kind of bag where he saw a book and writing. He rushed over to see what was in it, quickly flipping through the pages. He wondered if he had been summoned here by some predecessor, and read about some sort of device to create monsters. Hiding his face with the palm of his hand, the man thought about the fact that this golem had been created by his predecessor, and realized that he was now giving him this place. He asked himself about whether his research would be needed now. He thought about the fact that that form of woman was a god who decided to revive him after his death, and give him a task. Putting on the robe that lay nearby, he shouted that he would demonstrate his power and make the people of this world bow at his feet. And then he would become the king of demons. He laughed, thinking only that humanity did not have long to live. He figured he would do it, since his research had never seen the light of day. But the god told him that he would give him a special power, in that case, and a place that would belong to him alone. On the cliff above, a girl watched silently. She only said that she wanted to start training again, but she had discovered something more interesting. She thought she should return to the surface to the capital and the guild. The use of monsters and this place was too suspicious. Besides, she couldn't investigate all of this on her own. She had to explain the situation to Liliana or Aruna as soon as possible.